Hello, and welcome to our first webinar in our summer series. These are for our Supply Chain Forum partners, presented by UT's Global Supply Chain Institute. My name is Mary Long. I'm the Managing Director of our Supply Chain Forum. I will cover off on a couple of housekeeping items and then hand it off to Ted and Tom. The information on this slide will be copied into the chat if you need to reference it later. Please note that you'll use the Q&A function on your Zoom control panel to submit questions for the panelists. Like our events at Forum, you can upvote questions in the queue, and all webinar attendees will be muted. Ted and Tom will be asking a few live poll questions, and your answers will all be anonymous. If you have questions for our tech team during the webinar, send an email to the gsti@utk.edu email versus using the Q&A. After the webinar, you will receive an email tomorrow with links to this recording and to this slide deck. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, two of our very own UT Supply Chain Management faculty, Tom Goldsby and Ted Stank. Tom serves as our Haslam Chair of Logistics, and Ted is our GSCI Faculty Director and serves as the Bruce Chair of Excellence. They both bring decades of supply chain research and experience and insights. I will now mute and disappear, and I'm leaving you in good hands, and I'll join you again at the end of the webinar. Bye, Ted and Tom.
Thank you, Mary. Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name's Tom Goldsby. As Mary indicated, I'm joined by my longtime friend and collaborator, Ted Stank. We're really thrilled to be talking about a very important topic today, supply chain agility, and perhaps how it can help to accommodate disruption. We wanted to start off, though, by getting a pulse read on your perspectives. And Ted, I'll let you provide some commentary here while I set up the poll.
Okay. Thanks, Tom, and welcome, everyone. Yeah, Tom and I have been spending a lot of time over the last several months on this topic of agility, even before we went into the COVID shutdown. And one of the things that we've realized in conversations with our industry partners is that instead of making this a non-issue, the COVID disruption has made it all the more important. And so we think it's a great, timely topic for us to be talking to you about. So what you see popping up on your screen now is just something to kind of get us all a little bit dipping our toes in the water on the topic. One of the things that has made the COVID shutdown so unique is that it has struck us all along the supply chain. And so what we'd like you to indicate here and indicate all that apply are what major form of supply chain disruption has your firm experienced in the past 3 months? So I'll give everybody a chance to respond to these, and then we'll be able to accumulate these and let you know what the answers are.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Ted. We're going to give folks just a little more time, but I did want to take an opportunity. I think supply chain has, in the early days of this pandemic, was kind of thrown under the bus as folks might have run into some empty store shelves, as people were hoarding some select items like toilet paper and sanitizer and such. But I'll have to say it's been a proud several weeks on my part to think about how supply chain professionals have really been heroes throughout all this. And there's no way any supply chain could have anticipated some of the hazards and challenges that were thrown at it. But meanwhile, through agility, in large part, we've been able to accommodate pretty darn well.
That said, Tom, there's a lot of different definitions of agility, right? And what we've seen, particularly in the early part of the COVID shutdown, was just a lot of brute force attempts at agility, just throwing a lot of people and labor at it. For those of you in the operating realm out there, I'm sure you all spent countless days and hours in the early days trying to make sure that we could keep product flowing.
That's the idea. Ted, I'm going to end the poll, and let's go ahead and share the results with people. And I think it's pretty fascinating to see these numbers. We've been affected in a lot of different ways, certainly upstream as well as within our own operations, and then downstream in a couple of different ways, right? Demand disruption was the single form of disruption that we've seen As most prominent, 70% of those who responded indicated that demand disruption had been the most perhaps significant form of disruption. But then the next option, demand surge, by a third of our respondents, showed something of a whiplash effect, right, that's been taking place here. So I think it really helps to set up our conversation quite well for what we want to talk, both upstream, downstream, as well as within the four walls of your own operations.
You know, Tom, heading into this, it's worth mentioning that at the very least, one of the benefits we as supply chain management professionals have gotten out of it is that supply chain management is a phrase that everyone is saying today, even if you'd never heard of it 4 months ago. So with that, I think that kind of is a good segue into where you're going to take us next.
That's exactly right. So let's get back into the presentation itself. And those that have been around the hallowed halls of the UT Haslam College of Business for any point in time, and certainly engaged with the Global Supply Chain Institute and Supply Chain Forum, have probably seen this slide before. And it's something that very much speaks of the role that we see for supply chain management within the organization in terms of creating value for the firm, but perhaps most importantly in the eyes of customers. And this diagram suggests that it all starts with the customer. And as you have that kind of whipsaw effect in demand, both rapid increases and perhaps some decrease in demand, we've got to adjust our supply chains as the customer informs demand, which then in turn informs supply, and then relates to the larger cog that you see on the right side that ultimately is about delivering great customer experience. And again, something that we've always taught and preached at UT Haslam is that if you're really, really good at delivering on the bill of rights, the right product, right place, right time, and so forth, you can create stickiness with the customer. And I think that now the opportunity has never been greater than it is right now. That if you can deliver reliably, now is maybe the time to win over customers, perhaps more than we've seen in recent history. So just to kind of frame the conversation, I always like to go to analogy, and I'm an avid runner myself. I was never very fast though. I never did do the 100-meter sprint, which is what we're looking at here. Is you're looking down the barrel of a 100-meter lane, and it's all about straight out speed. And I think that our supply chains have been pretty well equipped over the last decade or so to compete based on all out speed. If you think about understanding what customers want, devising products that accommodate those wants and needs, getting them to market quick, and then continuously replenishing on an ongoing basis, that's quite a challenge for sure. But I think that what we're facing now are obstacles getting in the way of that straight out speed, and hence that puts an onus on agility. As I indicate here, straight line speed won't get the job done. We've got to bob and weave. We've got to do some side steps. Might even have to do a reverse around. Of course, we're all hoping that we see football here in the coming months, and that our tried and true beloved volunteers are able to get around defenders like this. But as we've been using analogy quite a bit to frame the problem of supply chain agility, we go to this example. We've been talking about the greats, so a little bit of back and forth as to maybe who the greatest running backs of all time have been. But those are folks that didn't necessarily have the best all-out speed, the best 40-yard time. They're the ones that could do that sidestep. They could avoid the tackle. Now, granted, I think what we're facing now with the onslaught of challenges in this time of COVID, we're not trying to evade a single defender, right? It's almost like our opponents have cleared the benches, and even the coaching staff of our opponents are out there trying to tackle us. So I think the challenge is greater than what we've seen, but I think the analogy still holds up pretty well.
So Tom, that's a great analogy. And I look forward to hearing what you've got to say to our audience regarding what those different components of agility are. But to take it from the football field, and by the way, if you're following, Tennessee has the #2 recruiting class for class of 2021. So I don't know if this guy is one of our 4 or 5 star linebacker recruits out there, Tom.
Well, the point being, we're chomping at the bit to take the field again, right?
Right. But to take it back to the supply chain realm, how do you define supply chain agility?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. So, I'm going to go to a definition that comes right back to UT faculty. David Gligor, who was one of your students, Ted, you collaborated with Mary Holcomb in his dissertation, and he's built quite a name for himself in the area of supply chain agility. And I love the way that you all very succinctly said that supply chain agility represents a company's ability to quickly adjust tactics and operations within its supply chain. And you all went a step further beyond those eloquent words. You developed these 5 dimensions. We'll see here. There we go. And really broke it down. And I think that this is really critical. The breaking down of agility is critical conceptually so that we can start to build it. And you all spoke of alertness, accessibility, decisiveness, swiftness, and flexibility. And you see a brief description for each of those dimensions here. But I think that notion that you first have to sense that something needs your attention. It could be a challenge, it could be an opportunity, but there's something that you need to react to. You need to then access that information, determine maybe what the options available to you might be, take swift, decisive action, implement those actions, and then be ready to adjust as necessary. So I think this is a beautiful playbook of what anyone needs to think about as they want to orchestrate agility in their supply chains.
Yeah, and it bears mentioning, Tom, to take it back to that sports analogy, David was very interested in how supply chains and how companies within a supply chain could be agile. And he was a little bit frustrated to see so many different definitions of what agility is in the supply chain. So he took it to a real foundational level and actually pulled a lot of these dimensions from the sports medicine research world. So it is appropriate to kind of think about this as a great athlete. David's Romanian, so he links it a lot to his enjoyment of soccer players. And if you think about some of the greats in soccer, again, they're not straight ahead fastest runners, rather they're the ability to change direction, see the field, etc.
Excellent. So there are a lot of reasons why we're concerned with agility. And some of these are within the 4 walls, if you will. Many of them are upstream, involving, in some cases, limitations or challenges, opportunities you might have with the supply base. But for the most part, you're seeing a lot of influence from the downstream market influences in terms of customers, what they expect, what they demand. Anyone that's heard me talk in recent times, I refer to today's consumer as being diabolical. I think we've all become little monsters, and we don't just check that attitude at home, right? We bring it to the workplace. Frankly, we see what Amazon has been able to deliver. And Ted, how many times have you heard in any sort of conversation, if Amazon can do it, why can't we do it? And so they're really redefining the value proposition in source, make, deliver. And so there's an abundance of influences driving us toward greater levels of agility, but ultimately I think it comes down to increased demands and less time. We're being forced to compress the time that we sense market changes and react to them and accommodate them. And also this sense of vulnerability and uncertainty that's out there. I think that there's upside and downside risks that we're trying to manage by virtue of being more agile.
Yeah, Tom, when you even link this again to this broader environment of where we are and have been with the COVID-19 crisis, what has really shaped a lot of the economic activity is our ability to get products. And so we're all familiar with the empty store shelves for paper products like toilet paper and paper towels. Increasingly now we're starting to see some shortages in various different types of meat supplies, as we've had shutdowns in processing plants, et cetera. And it really links to these changes in demand and inability of certain supply chains to respond to that demand in time, particularly given at the same time changes upstream in the supply chain. So this issue of supply chain agility, again, rather than being put on the shelf during these times of disruption, seem to become even more magnified at times like this.
You know, and Ted, this is not to make light of this, but a prop arrived at my door just minutes before we went live. And this was our supply of toilet paper that arrived at our doorstep just moments ago. And I'll have to say, the Goldsby family never before purchased in such mass quantities. I'd like to think that we're not earning the label hoarders, but you know, certainly our consumer behavior has changed in recent times.
Let me ask you this, Tom, from a time standpoint, when did you order that?
It was ordered last week. So it was a lead time of about 5 to 6 days, I would guess.
Yeah, but if that had happened a month or so ago or 6 weeks ago, it probably would have just arrived.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, I think, 3 Amazon fulfillment centers within about 2 miles of where I am here in Central Ohio right now. And yeah, it would have been here, if not same day, certainly next day.
So Tom, just to mention quickly for our audience, if you want to submit questions, you go to the Q&A button down at the bottom right hand of your screen. We've got a couple of questions that come up. If you don't want to write your own question, you might be watching those and vote. And what I'll do is periodically, as we hit the right timing of some of these questions, I'll stop Tom and we'll pose some of these questions. I'm going to let you go on now, Tom, because I think we have some stuff coming up that relate to both of the questions that we have right now, but we'll make sure that we get to these.
Yeah. So with regard to the limits to supply chain agility, here you see quite a list presented as a brick wall. Hopefully they're not impenetrable barriers. Hopefully you can overcome some of these. But as I always assert to my students, whenever flexibility is free, take as much of it as you can. However, at some point, you're going to find that there's some need to change your business operations, processes, or to make some form of investment, at which time you have to start making strategic decisions, perhaps. But these are some common limitations to supply chain agility. And again, as we're seeing here, some of them are within the confines of your 4 walls. It might be bureaucracies and conventional wisdoms. I also have this term inertia, which is a kind way of saying, hey, it's the way we've always done it. We're going to continue doing things in the same fashion, whether it's your decision making or your operations. And then still other things you're seeing in terms of the broader supply chain, lack of visibility of demand, lack of visibility of your supply chain operations. And so it's a real litany of things, but hopefully over the course of our conversation, we'll start to talk about some ways that we can address these limitations, and if not overcome them, mitigate them to some extent.
So Tom, I'm gonna stop you really quickly. I have 2 things. I know we have a poll question coming up, but before we go into that, related to this one, we have one question about, can you comment on what you think are some of the cost increases that we've seen related to COVID-19 crisis and how that is influencing agility, how those cost increases are impacting agility?
Yeah, just to speak of some, obviously, there's some cost of your own operations as we talk about people on the front lines that are engaging in some element of hazard operation, if you will, as social distancing introduced itself. And frankly, we had to call people to work to keep the supply chain running at times when, a lot of folks were staying at home. And so we saw inflation in labor rates. We similarly saw inflation in trucking, particularly during that immediate surge that happened. Transportation, trucking rates in particular have been really fluctuating, kind of up and down. It's a little hit and miss. But certainly we've seen a variety of different inflationary forces. Also, I'd say that just the nature of doing business has changed dramatically, which has taken us out of our conventions. I can't help but notice that you and I are broadcasting from home, right? Which might not be where we would typically broadcast. So there's somewhat, different ways of conducting business, and it's taken a period of adjustment as we figure out how to make decisions and enact those decisions. And they all come with a little bit of a premium involved. I know a lot of folks had to get laptops in the hands of their workforce, and in some cases they were, getting dedicated air flights to help achieve the distribution of things. So there's been a remarkable assortment of different ways of conducting business, and just about all of them involve some premium over typical cost of doing business.
Yeah, and I do know that we're going to get into some of the different ways of achieving agility and what the relative costs and investment are for each of those different ways. So I'm going to leave that for a minute. We have a question with actually quite a number of votes related to how do we get agility, but I'm going to leave that until after this next poll question, which is related to the obstacles. So again, selecting all that apply. What are your views as an audience on the obstacles to your supply chain achieving the agility that you and your managers would like to have?
Yeah, with regard to economics there, we're obviously talking resources of all kinds. It could involve financial outlays. It could involve, just dramatically different ways of conducting business.
So that's related to that cost question.
Right. We're seeing
Tom and I have had the benefit of at one point we were doing it weekly, of meeting with several of the leading leaders of our partner companies to get a sense of the kinds of things that their companies were doing to adjust. And this was particularly true during March and into April, while this was all just kind of flowing over all of us. And it was really remarkable to hear how supply chain management professionals really have the ability to kind of roll up their sleeves and understand what's going on at the ground level and make things happen. And it was kind of a case study in agility, if you will.
That's right. Well, it looks like about 60% of people have responded to this point. Maybe we'll afford just another few seconds here, and we'll close the poll and share those results. We'll give it a 3, 2, 1 countdown. And this is pretty interesting to see the market situation limiting your ability to be agile, and what that might suggest is that customers just won't, it's on this point. I think it's interesting, Ted, that my observation, I wish I had some data to back this up, but I think, certainly the Goldsby household and perhaps yours and others around the country, around the world, were a little bit tolerant, maybe even understanding of the challenges we had in stocking shelves in the early goings of the pandemic. And maybe that's been sustained, as you indicated, that box that I presented earlier, rather than that being delivered inside of 48 hours, it was more like 6 days. However, my sense is that tolerance is starting to wane. We're expecting things, particularly as the economy is reopening, again on a state-by-state basis, but we're expecting life to resume normalcy, which is where we can become, so demanding, perhaps even diabolical again in our supply chain behaviors. This might suggest, again, with 63% of respondents saying the market situation is a limitation, might suggest the market just won't allow time, because it does call for a degree of experimentation, right? If you're going to try to do something different, it can cause some internal disruption to your business, and maybe for a period of time slow things down conceivably.
Yeah. And one of the, we work with companies from across the board in terms of industry. One of the things we've seen with consumer oriented companies is that we've achieved something that supply chain people have been trying to get for about 30 years or more maybe, which is a reduction in the complexity of the number of products we're producing. If there's a base product that we can make, regardless of package size or color, et cetera, we're going to pump it out there and get it out there. So from a market situation standpoint, I can definitely see that that's one of the major obstacles. But Tom, let's move away from obstacles for a minute. One of the questions I have that has received the most votes is Let's start moving into what are the kinds of things you're seeing that companies can do to improve agility,
Sure.
particularly during this crisis or any disruption.
Yeah. So as I think about how you all, some years back thought of supply chain agility as that kind of sense and respond series of actions, contemporary supply chain wisdom suggests that you try to simplify your supply chain, move the decoupling point upstream, and I'll explain that in just a moment, and then listen and react fast. So it would suggest that supply chain agility is a function of your supply chain network, that demand signal, and ideally the demand signal that's emanating from the end user at the end of the supply chain, someone who's actually using, consuming, experiencing a product or service, and then having the supporting operations in place to allow for that inaction of the demand signal. And so to that point of to the notion of the decoupling point, what you see is that divider line there between where push meets pull. And you see the push arrow heading off to the right. And what we mean by push is forecast-based or forecast-driven actions, where we all in a supply chain have some best guess of what we expect future demand to look like, and we source, make, deliver kind of according to what we expect near-term demands to be. That's your push. And yeah, I do label it as a guess below the arrow. On the other hand, we see pull going upstream, and some of our, certainly our end users, but some of our immediate suppliers, those perhaps retailers out there that are able to stock the shelves and replenish on a depletion basis. And that would be a pull or Kanban system, as we often speak in lean realms. And ideally, companies pursuing agility would try to shift the push meets pull boundary upstream in the supply chain. We see that one box in the middle that might be a manufacturer or final assembler. And in this instance, it suggests that they are pushing. They're relying on a forecast for their capacity and execution. They're sourcing, making, and delivering according to forecast. Now, to the extent that we could shift that pull arrow upstream, it would be a make-to-order provision that when an order lands on their desk, they start producing that product. And conceivably, you could even shift it further upstream to what we call a buy-to-order arrangement or manufacturing strategy. And that's been the conventional wisdom of how you need to implement supply chain agility. And
So
there's some.
Tom, let me
Sure.
interrupt you for a second,
Sure.
just to kind of help us all understand this. Let's think about it in a consumer setting. So what you're saying is traditional consumer operations would be a push using a forecast to buy raw materials, create a production schedule and make product, push it through our distribution network based on a distribution plan, and ultimately have it arrive on a retailer shelf where it's sitting there waiting for us based on a forecast of when we're going to come in and buy it, right?
Exactly. And
Whereas
I
what
may have seen me cross my fingers here because we hope we've got a pretty reliable forecast that's driving all that action. And we
Right.
just cross our fingers and hope that supply meets demand.
Right. And so what somebody like Amazon has done has shifted that decoupling point upstream to some regional distribution holding location, because they know that there's a whole bunch of people in this particular regional area that are going to buy that pack of toilet paper. And instead of having to guess where that purchase is going to happen, they delay or postpone that guess and wait until you place your order and then react very quickly to pick it and ship it to you, right?
Right. And that's what they're doing on, say, the 10%, and that's a big rough round number, 10% of stuff that they even bother to stock. But for that other 90% or so that they don't bother to stock, it's a drop ship proposition. They receive your order, pass it along to a vendor and say, hey, we're not even going to touch that, but it's your responsibility to deliver, which is another agile form of accommodation.
Okay. So that's kind of the difference you see when you order from Amazon in same day or next day delivery with Amazon Prime versus something that's drop shipping directly from a vendor on Amazon Marketplace that may take upwards of 10 days potentially.
yeah, it's up to that vendor to, and whatever they can negotiate with the consumer to get expeditious fulfillment and delivery. Yeah.
So, let's touch on another topic then. In order to get that, right now it seems like if you're going to push that decoupling point upstream, you better have Amazon-like network capabilities with huge capitalization. I mean, how many hundreds of order fulfillment centers do they have around the US and around the globe? So are you suggesting the only way to get that kind of agility would be to make that kind of capital investment, which would obviously take a lot of time as well, to engender that kind of agility?
Well, it's not the only way. And we'll offer some glimpses of other ways to achieve agility. This, again, what's depicted here is conventional wisdom. And I think it's the way most people think about achieving agility. And it is a, dare I say, a surefire way of getting there, but it's incredibly taxing to make it happen, because the amount of influence you need to have in the supply chain with your suppliers, dare I say, even with your customers, with logistics service providers and others required to make that happen, it does kind of, it tends to be the likes of Amazon, that 1,200-pound gorilla in a supply chain to make that happen.
So you're suggesting there might be some other ways, huh?
Yeah. And just to kind of keep things moving, Ted, just to kind of look at how some people are trying to orchestrate, if they're not that 1,200-pound gorilla in the supply chain, the reality is that, I think something else that the common person has started to appreciate even more so in recent months is the global nature of our supply chains. That we are largely dependent on Chinese sources of supply, have been over the last 30 to 40 years, going in that direction. Even as companies might have migrated out of China, they found that they still had raw material supplies that were coming through, being sourced from China, which posed some real challenges, particularly in the early days of this pandemic. And so what I'm suggesting here is something that you're hearing quite a bit about. We have been for some time in supply chain circles, this notion of regionalization of our supply chains, trying to look, even if we don't source at home, we're looking to sources closer to home, within the CONUS, if you will, within a day's shipment of being inbound, maybe of a source of supply that you can virtually see, as opposed to one that's stretched around the world that might have 3 or 4 days on the water, let alone the time it takes to process in order to fulfill it and get it to export market and import market.
Yeah, I do believe, not only due to COVID-19 disruption, but due to tariffs, et cetera, that we are approaching a time where the global commerce structure of the last 70 years is starting to break down, and we're going to go to a more regionalized, as you have portrayed here, perspective on supply network design. Not to say we're not going to still buy some things from China, but I think it's going to be very interesting over the next 5 years to see how we have shifts.
Yeah, I think something that was realized even by seasoned supply chain professionals in recent months was, just because you have a contract with a tier 1 or perhaps even a tier 2 supplier, it's no guarantee that you're going to get your stuff. Contracts during times of force majeure are everyone's best intentions to do something. And even if you had service agreements, and contracts that were yay thick, it was no guarantee that you were going to get your stuff, or that you were going to even enjoy priority on the limited assortment that was available. So I think the old common practice, it's a supply chain 101 tactic of mapping the supply chain as far upstream as well as downstream, is going to be really vital now, more so than ever.
Yeah. So the giant deflating sound, which is kind of the bookend to Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. And
yeah, it's a little play there. Back when Ross was that third-party candidate, and he talked about the giant sucking sound of NAFTA being implemented and all those jobs going to Mexico. What's interesting, I refer to the deflating sound. Like you said, I think China is going to continue to be a major player in our supply chains as a destination market, as well as a vital source of supplies for many, many, many components as well as goods. But I do see some dissipation of their influence throughout Southeast Asia, as we have been seeing. But also, I think this is going to be a boon for Mexico. You know, we do have the new USMCA in place. Some people are referring to it as NAFTA 2.0, and it presents great opportunity, I think, for Mexico.
Yeah. Just as a little plug for some of the parallel research stream we're working on, if anyone's interested, we have a new white paper out called EPIC, which is a framework for understanding global network design. We just published it in, I think, late February. So if you want to do a Google, I think all of our forum members can find it on the GSCI website.
Excellent. Very good. So, Ted, I'm going to now address a question that you sent my way a few minutes ago before I went into this regionalization notion. You were asking if it all involves kind of heavy lifting, right? Does it all have to be structural? Do we have to redesign our supply chains? And like I said, I think that's one pretty sure way to get it done, but that's a very expensive, time-consuming way to do it as well. So if I can go back to the Gligor, Holcomb, Stank conceptualization of agility, and this is something that in the work that we're currently doing in the Advanced Supply Chain Collaborative has really helped to illuminate, and we've been able to leverage this quite a bit with the partners working with us on the project, that as we see it, those first three dimensions of alertness, accessibility, and decisiveness really involve the brain, the cognitive dimensions of agility, the ability to sense and access information, make ready certain decisions. Then the heavy lifting aspects that tend to come with all the investment, or significant investment anyway, are swiftness and flexibility that might call for, you know, redesigning your supply chain networks, changing supply partnerships and so forth, using faster modes of transportation, all that. Again, those options are very much on the table, but I have to say that in recent weeks, based on the research we've been conducting, I've been seeing tremendous opportunity on those first three elements. Just the fact that we might try to plan a little closer to demand, maybe increase our planning frequency, use more ready recent pieces of data to respond.
Tom, that relates to a question that I just answered online by typing from Brent Ruth about the concept of demand-driven MRP and the need to get better demand information closer to real time in a granular format. So one of the real encouraging things I think that Tom and I have experienced in this research over the last several months has been that we might be able to engender agility not just through that traditional way of massive investment in changing our networks and our manufacturing plant capabilities, et cetera, but potentially through better access and use of information.
Well, I shared earlier that I love analogy, and this next slide is a simple visual depiction of ultimately what we're trying to accomplish in supply chain management day to day, whether we're trying to be more agile or not. Let me just explain, depends upon where you grew up, perhaps, as to whether or not this is a seesaw or a teeter-totter. I grew up in the Midwest, we called it a seesaw. But anyway, on one side of the seesaw, you've got the big black box that is demand. And that's a big, heavy box. And the countervailing force to that demand box then is found on the other side, as designated with I and C, being our inventory and our capacity. Now, it may not be necessarily the inventory that we have within our four walls and our own distribution operations and so forth. It could be the larger supply networks, inventory and capacity. But I think to kind of a supply chain 101 treatment of it, we might be trying to manipulate inventory and capacity solely to accommodate that big demand box. But a keen student of supply chain management, like the folks we have at UT, is going to realize, hey, there's another variable here. The one that's labeled P, the fulcrum upon which the board rests. And what happens if we move that board, or if we move the fulcrum to the left in particular? We move it closer to the demand box. Well, what happens is we enjoy greater leverage with the existing inventory and capacity. And so just as you responded to that question to suggest, you know, in a demand-driven MRP, in essence, what we're doing is we're moving that fulcrum to the left. And we don't need as much inventory and capacity. In fact, if we can counterbalance the force of demand with a new balance that's established. And so I've recognized several different observations to come from that. One, I've added the hands above and below the box that suggests that supplier reliability comes into play here too. If you do have ready, able, willing suppliers to help the cause, you know, they can also exert some downward pressure and help counterbalance that demand box. However, if you have unreliable suppliers or they're way off around the world with erratic lead times, you know, that can actually force it up and you need more inventory and capacity to accommodate. So supplier capabilities can help or hurt your cause. Not only are the boxes key variables, but as our research is really helping me to better understand, and hopefully others, is that plan, the fulcrum, is a major force for change and a major force for agility. And then finally, just another piece of the analogy as we talk about extended supply chains, long boards are difficult to balance and prone to snap and break. And I think we've kind of experienced some of that in recent times.
Yeah, Tom, just to add a quick insight on your supplier reliability comment there. One of the things that we have seen, not only in the last few months during the COVID disruption, but also prior to that, is that a different perspective on supplier relationships and supplier governance structures is required to achieve the kinds of agility we're trying to achieve without massive investment in plant and network design.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, that's an element I introduced recently. And I have to say that came from dialogue with students as they talked about, hey, this seems to suggest that you have the inventory and capacity. What's the role of suppliers? And I felt the need to make the suppliers' hands not so invisible here, but to introduce them to the analogy. Hey, but just getting back to ways to maybe move that fulcrum, the plan, closer to the demand box. You know, it's before this pandemic started setting in, we were getting really excited about advanced technologies that could help us to see, think, and act differently in the supply chain. And this seeing, thinking, acting makes attribution to some research that we did last year with UT colleagues and those at Ohio State, where we tried to better understand the role of digitalization in our supply chains. And I thought this was a simple, eloquent way to kind of express the different ways in which digitalization, whether it's digitalization of information, digitalization of actual product, could influence how we see, think, and act differently in the supply chain. And here you see some examples, and many of our 4-member companies, I think, are pretty active in different ways, whether it's implementing these technologies or even creating them. Things like end-to-end supply chain visibility has kind of been a dream that we've had in supply chain, and it's been really encouraging to see the dramatic steps that have been taken to enjoy better end-to-end visibility in our supply chains.
Yeah, so like so many other things that we've seen, this COVID disruption, to me, has accelerated a number of different trends. One of those big trends being the push into advanced digitalization and advanced tools to be able to both capture and analyze data and input it into our various different planning scenarios so that we can get closer to real time with more granularity. And I see things like cloud-based systems, software as a service, blockchain, that kind of stuff. In order to educate myself more, I am halfway through an MIT computer science course right now on digital technology. It's somewhat painful, but I felt like I needed to have a deeper knowledge of what's happening in that black box. And we just finished a section on cloud-based systems. And if you're not thinking of cloud-based systems right now as a potential answer for your data strategies, you need to look into it very quickly and very deeply.
Excellent.
So Tom,
Hey,
I have another question that's gotten a number of votes here. Comes out of a timely manner. What do you see as the trade-off or relationship between agility and resilience in the supply chain?
You're reading my mind, Ted. It's amazing. I see it as possibly being an equivocation that agility can be a vital form of resilience. I think often, though, when we think of resilience, we think of like an ironclad supply chain. And I think if this pandemic has shown anything, there is no such thing as an ironclad, wholly resilient supply chain. There's just no way that anyone could have prepared for millions of consumers going out and buying mass quantities of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and other items. But I do think that agility can be a viable, pretty accessible form of resilience. And what do you know? It's pretty good whether we're dealing with, again, black swan events is one thing, but if you're dealing with, supplier disruption of a more conventional sense, or just erratic movements in demand markets, agility is a pretty good investment, particularly if you can do so from the cognitive standpoint and get some immediate gains that way. They may not even call for the investments that could take years to implement, as you talk about revolutionizing your way of doing business, revolutionizing your supply chains. And so I just have a little asterisk there that when I think of agility now, it's really about not getting boxed in, having options and creating options. And we're seeing a lot more of that options thinking. It's something we've always associated with the financial sectors, with options, but we're seeing that come into play now in our supply chain as we get away from sole sourcing, as we might want to diversify our portfolio of customers as well as service providers. And so it's kind of not putting all eggs in one basket and creating options that you can pretty quickly adjust from one to another.
Yeah, Tom, Mary Holcomb and I had another doctoral student, a guy by the name of Sergei Ponomarev, who was really interested in resilience, and his dissertation research really focused on this idea of resilience. And in that work, resilience was defined not necessarily as one definition as an ironclad supply chain. Another measure of resilience was how quickly you could get back up to speed after suffering a disruption. And as you think about the way we've talked about agility today, a lot of it is based on alternative options to be able to move forward and speed of moving forward. So you can see that equivalence that you have there between agility and resilience. And so I don't see from that definition of resilience that there is a conflict between the notion of agility and the notion of resilience.
Yeah, I think as I've thought about it, it seems like something of a conundrum. Would I rather be agile or resilient? I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game. I don't think it's an either-or proposition. In fact, as I've come to mature a little bit in my thinking on this, I think agility is a very viable form of resilience. And one thing, just to kind of, as I start to wrap up some of my observations, we open things up to questions. This is a slide I've been using for a long time. And hey, I'm not a scientist, so I use a layperson's explanation here of the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the principle or law of entropy. And I think we've probably heard the term entropy, and it's kind of this notion of chaos. And loosely stated, that second law of thermodynamics says a system left unto itself will grow in complexity. And I've always challenged supply chain professionals, we're really good at putting out fires. And I think oftentimes we have a certain sense of pride in our ability to adjust and take care of problems that are presented to us. But at some point, we need to try to get ahead of the problems. And I think agility is one way, again, a very important, viable way to get ahead of the problems. And I just challenge folks to be thinking about, whether your supply chain is going to manage you or you're going to manage your supply chain. And I think agility affords us that opportunity to to be a little bit better ready for anything, whatever that anything might be.
Yeah, and to kind of go back again to the project Tom and I are working on, what has really been encouraging to us is to see that these concepts are being applied in a multitude of industries, ranging from consumer packaged goods, fast moving consumer goods, heavy equipment, boutique chemical industry, specialty chemicals, those kinds of things. So we think that if you take it from that conceptual level and really focus on how can you apply some of these things, given the nature of your product and the nature of demand in the market you're serving, there are a lot of ways that you can apply these kinds of ideas.
I think that's an important point. Ted, if I could just pick up, process industries are not renowned as being particularly agile. And I think our project has helped to illuminate some ways, even if it's not within the four walls, ways that companies that are very process driven can incorporate some elements, whether it's upstream or downstream.
So Tom, I'm going to come at you with a couple of questions here that are good ones. One of them I know is going to get you passionate. And I'm going to hit you with two that are kind of related. So the first one is, do you feel that lean culture hinders agility? Because I know you've spent a good portion of your career working with Robert Martichenko of LeanCor on the notion of lean in supply chain. So that's one that mentions that culture word. And the second one is, what do you see as the biggest way that companies can make progress on cognitive dimensions? The cultural change seems so difficult at times. So these are both questions that are related to culture. One about lean and one about adopting more agile planning processes, if you will, in cognition.
Yeah, thanks. You can see me getting a little hot under the collar with this. So, lean's been thrown under the bus pretty readily in recent times, and I'm a huge advocate of lean thinking. And I think if you associate lean as simply lightening your inventory as a way to just reduce your inventory investment, I do think that assertion needs to get thrown under the bus. But if you embrace more holistic lean thinking, where you are a process scientist, you understand the robustness and the limitations of your processes, I think if you're on a lean journey and you're facing the crisis we've seen, I would want to know what my process capabilities are. Even if you do maybe have some short-term stockouts that you're facing, having that intense knowledge of process, I think, will always pay rewards. But if you're simply reducing inventory, the old lean analogy, you're sure to crash your ship if you drain the inventory out of your system without eliminating the rocks.
Yeah.
So a process scientist eliminates those rocks and sails comfortably.
I certainly have not spent as much time exploring lean as you have, but the way I'll always explain it in classes is that lean is still an anticipatory technique, a way of anticipating form, time, and place requirements. It's just reducing the waste so you can do that quickly, because we all know that the shorter your time horizon is in planning, the more accurate it is. So if we can shorten our response time, we can plan in the not too distant future and have much greater certainty about what we're planning. Whereas pure response-based, year 2000 Dell operations is kind of we're not going to do anything until we get an order. That's not what lean is intended for. And to link it to that second question about cognitive dimensions and culture, really all we're talking about with these cognitive dimensional changes are, can we plan more frequently? Can we pull in our planning time horizons? We've worked with companies that will create their plans using 3-month time horizons, even though they're getting data in weekly. And so they're just not utilizing what they already have, largely because of the nature of their process. So if you said lean is about understanding and being process scientists, there you go. Let's apply it in the cognitive.
And in fact, I think the old conventional lean tools of value stream mapping and even the more classic process mapping could be really helpful to illustrate where you have those opportunities, right? Again, if you're capable of responding faster, but you're still relying on these long, time horizons for planning, to drive your execution, again, that's just, in my mind, that's money on the table. Those are pretty ready, easy opportunities, but you might need to illuminate it. And again, value stream mapping is great for illustrating what the opportunities are. And tell you what, when you all see as a group, know as a group, and act as a group, that's a beautiful thing. But VSM, value stream mapping, process mapping are great ways just to say, hey, here's the opportunity we have. And I think a lot of it, yeah, could be achieved on the cognitive side. They don't necessarily require the structural changes.
I'm sitting here laughing when you're talking about process mapping, et cetera, because a couple of the members of Tom and my research team are engineers. In particular, one's a PhD in industrial engineering, and he's constantly preaching, all we have to do is map the process. It's basic blocking and tackling, but it's highly effective and necessary.
Absolutely.
Tom,
hey, I know we've got one more poll question. Can we?
Yeah, let's run that poll question, and then we'll kick back to Mary to wrap things up.
Okay.
So this last poll question is, what do you think is your best opportunity, given what we've talked about for the last almost an hour? What do you think is your best opportunity to focus and gain agility? And I'll give you just a little glimpse into some of the things Tom and I are working on. We're trying to quantify it, but our hunch is that we can get a lot of effectiveness out of focusing on these cognitive elements without having to incur a whole lot of additional operating expense and asset commitment.
What do you say we give just another few ticks here, and then we'll close the poll and share those results. We'll give a 3, 2, 1 countdown, and it looks like we've got 50% response, maybe a shade more. All right. Sorry for those folks that didn't quite get the time to respond, but here are the results we generated with a little more than half of you. 60% spoke of enhancing operational flexibility. That's what I define as maybe the more traditional forms. It might involve different techniques within the four walls operationally. It could involve engaging with suppliers differently, setting some different terms and service level expectations with suppliers as well as logistics service providers. And then the other two options are a little bit more on the cognitive side of things. Wouldn't you say, Ted?
They would. I would say the first two are cognitive, and I would close it by saying, stand by for next year when we've got a research project that looks at quantifying the impact of those different alternatives. And I'm sure, Mary, you will schedule us for a webinar to talk to them next year when we get some of those results, right?
I will. Thanks, Ted and Tom. Thank you so much for this engaging discussion on agility. This has been great. And I do want to thank everyone who participated in our webinar. You know, these events don't happen with a lot of behind the scenes effort. So special thanks to our invisible co-host, Hannah Kirby, our marketing director, Michelle Painter, and our homegrown technical support volunteer, Cole Burns. Tomorrow, you will all receive an email with links to the recording of this webinar and the slide deck. As a reminder, this is a 3-part series. So our next webinar is on June 23rd and features Wendy Tate and Mary Holcomb. And they will be talking with us about global supply chains from triage to the new abnormal that we're all living in now. Be sure to subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on social media. And make sure that will help you make sure that you can receive future invitation and updates from the Global Supply Chain Institute so that you'll get our webinar invite. Your feedback is really important to us, so please fill out our survey before you go. It's just a quick satisfaction survey, and this helps us to improve. So again, thank you so much for being a part of this. And Ted and Tom, thank you so much for pulling together all of this information and really taking us through an engaging discussion. It's been great.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Ted.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. That is our